Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you about the book available for My Tiny Town Just Got Put on Lockdown parts 1 and 2 that are available now on Amazon. It's available on Kindle and on paperback, and if you'd like to read ahead for part 2 that we're just starting tonight, or if you want to get your hands on part 1, you can definitely do so in the link in the description down below. And now, on to tonight's story. Day 56. As I stood there feeling the anxiety beginning to flood my body, I watched the swirling purple fog creep towards the farmhouse that we had chosen for the night. A horrendous sense of dread began to loom over me, and my brain began screaming curses in my head. I had been so sure, so overwhelmingly confident, that it was all over and we would no longer need to deal with the terrors that had plagued us. After seeing virtually no sign of any of it, no creatures, no fog, for an entire month. Yet on this day, getting my 2-year-old Abby whatever I could find her for breakfast, I see the haunting swirls of purple and gray making its way back into our lives. "What is it?" Grace said as she carried Izzy into the kitchen where I was standing. She saw me staring out the window intently as she walked over to me. I glanced over at her with dread in my eyes and met her gaze. "Look. There in the distance," I said, pointing out the window. Her eyes widened as she looked out and saw the wall of fog creeping towards us like an imminent thunderstorm rolling into the area. "Daddy, I want donuts," Addie said from behind us, waiting as patiently as a 2-year-old can at the table. Yeah, okay, 1 second, sweetheart. Daddy's showing Mommy something outside," I responded, looking at Grace, catching the "what do we do now" look in her eyes. Being in the middle of absolute nowhere, surrounded by half-grown and deserted cornfields, somewhere in the open flatlands of Nebraska, we were able to see for miles in every direction. That was kind of the reason that we chose this particular farmhouse to take up residence. We thought that it had been far enough west since we hadn't seen any signs of the fog or creatures in so long. However, it clearly was not. The cupboards had been relatively full here, and we hadn't seen any sign of the actual owners, so we set up shop, so to speak, and decided to stay here as long as we could. It still had power, and the well pump worked just fine. The big natural gas tank sitting behind the house that supplied us with the means to run the water was, from what I could tell with my limited knowledge of them, mostly full. It seemed like a really good place to settle overall. Well, that, and it was the first house we came across for miles. I was sick of driving. "Daddy!" Addie called out. Her response snapped me back into focus, and the circus of thoughts bouncing around in my head faded. I walked to the cabinets and searched around, and our now dwindling food supply. We had been in the same house for nearly a month now without having to leave to get any new supplies, and I was very grateful for that fact. But as my mind returned to the side of the fog, I realized that this oasis of peace was about to come to an abrupt end. After searching for a few seconds, I found one last packet of powdered donuts that we had snagged from the vending machine at the rest stop. As soon as the rustle of wrappers sounded in the kitchen, Bodhi came trotting in and shot longing eyes at the donuts in my hand. "You'll have to consult Addie about this one, Poopy Face," I said as I tore the package open and set the donuts on the table in front of my daughter. Bodhi cocked his head to one side and chuffed at me before going to sit down on the floor next to Addie. He licked her elbow as she shoved the first donut in her mouth. She just giggled and patted him on the head before handing him a donut, which he promptly accepted. Looks like it's not moving very fast. It's gotta be miles away. My guess is we have at least 1, maybe 2 days before it gets here. And we need to leave, I said, finally turning back to my wife, who was still looking out the window. "You sure?" she replied. "No, absolutely not. It's just a guess based on what I can see from here. Honestly, for all I know, we could be engulfed in the fog and fighting off creatures to get out of here within the next hour," I said. Knowing it wasn't very reassuring, but it was the truth. I really didn't know how it was going to play out. After I said that, a tsunami of thoughts flooded my mind. Concerns about where to go next, the weapons we still had to defend ourselves, how long we truly had to prepare. I stood next to Grace, entranced in my own mind. staring out at the fog in the distance with her. Izzy began to babble and squirm around, so Grace sat her on the floor and let her crawl around. Unless she was contained, that little girl can barely sit still. I knew we still had the rifle and plenty of ammo for it. We still had the shotgun and a good amount of ammo for that as well. The 2 bows were still in our possession, as well as enough arrows. I still wish we'd been able to get our pistols back from our escape from that collapsing church and the cultists. But I saw no real benefit to dwelling on that thought. At least not now, since the situation had been so long past. When we first got to this house, we searched the place and found another 12-gauge shotgun. But it was a double barrel. Powerful, but not very efficient, since it had to be reloaded every 2 shots. We also found a 20-gauge shotgun that was also double-barreled. However, we only found a handful of shells for the 20-gauge. Oddly enough, there's also a harpoon gun with a harpoon hanging on the wall in the living room here. I wasn't sure if it was functional or just decoration. That also just begs the question of, why does a farmer in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, even have a harpoon gun? I mean, I highly doubt the guy ever went diving with sharks or whaling or whatever you might need a harpoon gun for. For a moment, the thought of setting up traps around the house and property crossed my mind, but it quickly faded as I realized that would only prolong the inevitable of us needing to pile in the SUV and leave anyway. That, and I wasn't sure what types of traps would even be efficient against the spider creatures and the fog lurkers. It's not like we had mines and grenades that we could set up around the yard, and I sure as hell wasn't trying to just trap any of them. "So what do you think we should do?" Grace finally said out loud. This broke me away from my thoughts again, put me back in the moment. It took me a second to reground my mind before I answered. "Well, I think we should start to pack things up so we're ready to move when the time comes. I'd like to soak up the time that we have left here as much as we can. I mean, I don't know about you, but I like being able to make real meals and sleep in an actual bed. I think we should be ready, but stay here as long as we can." "Okay, well, we both know that the fog means that shit is going to hit the fan sooner rather than later, so what's the plan when it does?" Grace asked with a considerate amount of snarkiness in her voice, one that I didn't much care for, but I did understand what she was getting at. "So we have roughly 2 months before it really gets into winter. Would you rather head up towards Alaska, going through Canada, see how the creatures deal with the blistering cold weather, knowing that it could possibly put us into situations where we're struggling to find heat and shelter ourselves? Or do you want to head more south and west, like Arizona, Mexico?" I knew that putting the ball in her court wasn't really the answer she was looking for, but it was the same choice that I had been struggling with in my head. I realized before that, without any abundance of fur, these creatures might not do so well in extreme cold, meaning that they would most likely try to avoid it, making things much safer from them. However, on the other side of that same coin, we'd be running the risk of getting trapped in an area without adequate shelter and heat for ourselves, and all freezing to death. Going to Arizona or Mexico area keeps us with better odds to survive the elements, but it also, more than likely, helps the creatures survive the elements. I didn't really know because I didn't have any true knowledge of these creatures' physiology, no idea of things they could or could not tolerate. I didn't have too much time to study them as I was fighting or running for my life. Apparently, the same string of thoughts had been going through Grace's mind because she answered my question exactly how I was thinking. It's always nice to know that we think alike. "I don't want to freeze to death. You know I hate being cold. I say we head south," she said with a slight hint of concern in her voice. "I always wanted to see Arizona." Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I should say that if you're just coming into the story, you probably have no idea what's going on. Well, lucky you, because there is a huge chunk of the story that you've missed, and I suggest you find it and read it and catch up yourself. That being said, here's a quick rundown. Hi, my name's Trevin. With me is my wife Grace, our 2-year-old daughter Addie, and our almost 1-year-old Izzy. We also have we have one dog named Bodhi. Let's see how I can put this. The world has been basically rocketed full speed into a smoldering dumpster fire. There are these violent creatures that release this strange purplish fog. We've run into insane cults that seem to be worshipping the creatures. At the same time, we've barely run into any other people besides ourselves. Well, the ones that are still alive anyway. The whole situation has been so sudden, so insane. I can't really explain it all here. So again, I suggest that if you haven't, please go and find the first entry and work your way forward to here. Anyway, back to my story. We spent the rest of the day slowly packing things up and getting them moved into the SUV, taking turns watching out the window at the slowly moving fog that seemed to symbolize some form of doom. Each time I took my turn to look out the window, I just imagined an army of beasts marching our way. I say it was coming towards us, but in reality, it was moving more like a wall that stretched out in both directions, farther than I could even see. By the time we got everything packed up and ready to move, when the time came, it had gotten rather late in the day. The fog still remained miles off in the distance, and Grace and I decided that it'd be safe to stay at least one more night in the house before leaving. Izzy crawled around the floor of the living room, just playing with anything she can get her hands on, while Addie sat at the kitchen table coloring pictures with a few crayons we'd been able to find. Bodhi followed Izzy around, making sure to inspect anything she might pick up, just in case it was something he could eat, while Grace and I sat on the couch next to each other, just watching. "I really don't want to keep doing this," Grace said, after a considerable amount of silence. "I thought it was over. I thought things were peaceful again." "Yeah. I thought we'd escaped the insanity by now, especially since it had been so long since we'd seen the fog, or any creatures," I replied. "What are we going to do, Trevin? I mean, do we have any real plans, or just a direction to travel in?" "Honestly, I have no idea. I know we have weapons, a working vehicle, some food we could take with us, and really, that's it. I have no idea what the rest of the country looks like, or what we'll run into next. I don't know where we should go, or what's going to be safe. I really just don't know. I'm flying blind here, just hoping that I'm making good decisions." "Well, you've kept us alive so far, so thank you." "I love you," Grace replied, realizing that through all this craziness, I've been doing the best I could with what I had to work with. "I love you too." "Now let's get the girls in bed," I said, kissing her on the forehead as I stood up. The first night after seeing the returning fog was difficult to fall asleep. My mind raced with both curiosity and dread. Just as every other night since we left the comfort of our own home, we slept in a big pile together in the same room. It was one of the only things that kept me, and I'm sure the rest of us, feeling safe enough to fall asleep. Before I could finally shut my eyes and drift off that night, so many thoughts and memories flooded my mind of our previous encounters. I touched my shoulder as my eyes began to close, feeling over the scars left from my first encounter with one of the fog lurkers. A flash of memories flicked behind my eyelids. The feeling of the creature's talons digging into my shoulder. The ominous clicking sound it made, but mostly the sight of what I had thought were eyelids, splitting, watching the hinging hollow spikes emerge from the empty sockets and prepare to strike. Day 57. Last night I dreamt of my first encounter with the fog. Standing near the Humvees in my hometown with my arm outstretched, piercing the edge of the gray mist, I watched the tendrils of purple swirl amongst the gray. And this time I didn't recoil as it wrapped itself around my hand. In my dream, I couldn't react, and the swirl of purple fog suddenly had pressure and began to sting my arm. I watched as my skin began to boil and turn black where the purple swirls touched me. I awoke to something I wasn't used to hearing. Bodhi was pacing back and forth from all the windows, softly woofing and letting out what I could call a nervous growl. My mind awoke before the rest of my body. Just as I opened my eyes, Bodhi walked over to me and licked my face and managed to touch my eyeballs with his tongue. I shot up and grabbed my eye at the sudden, extremely weird sensation. of a dog tongue on my eyeball. Jesus, what the fuck was that, puppy dog? He got in my eye on that one. Twitching and blinking rapidly to try and rid myself of the weird feeling in my eye, I heard him woof and run to the windows again. As soon as I regained my vision, I saw why he was acting nervous. Both of the windows in the room had 3 of the little gecko-looking lizards crawling across them. What the... I trailed off as I stood up and walked to the window nearest me before saying very casually, "Hey, Grace. Check it out." Her eyes shot open and she immediately jumped out of the bed. "What? What's wrong?" "Nothing. Quiet down. I just said, check this out," I said, motioning to the window and tapping on the glass. When I tapped on the glass, the geckos on the window scrambled off in search of shelter. They ran so quickly out of sight, the glow of their purple insides nearly made light trails across the glass. "Oh, weird. What are they?" she said. Just then I looked out past the panes of glass into the distance. I noticed that the fog had closed nearly half the distance it had been from us the day before. Shit. We're gonna have to make a decision by tonight. If it keeps up at this rate, we'll be in it all over again by tomorrow morning, I said, with a disappointed tone in my voice. "You never answered my question about the little lizard things on the window, but can we figure it out once we get some coffee in us?" Grace replied as she walked back to the kitchen and scooped Izzy up to carry her. "Oh, yeah, sorry, I don't really know. They're like these little geckos, but they seem pretty harmless. And if you get a close look at them, they look really cool. They have like clear skin, their organs glow purple. I think they'd make a very interesting pet," I said, as I walked to wake Addie for the day. "Well, I mean, I think they would if they weren't associated with the other bloodthirsty nightmare creatures, the ones that try to kill us." Grace looked back and smiled. "Yeah, I mean, if it weren't for that, small details." I smiled back and let out a chuckle as we made it into the kitchen. Luckily, we had made it this long and hadn't once needed to go without coffee in the morning. Kind of is amazing the things you try to hold on to, trying to maintain any sense of normalcy when the world's falling apart around you. As I filled the coffee maker, I looked out the window in front of the kitchen sink and noticed that there were lots of these little green geckos everywhere. And I mean everywhere. They were on the grass, the trees, resting on the corn leaves, and everything. Actually, they were still pretty spread out, but there were still a lot of them outside. I walked around the kitchen with Grace holding Izzy, and Addie sitting in her own chair eating some sort of muffin that we'd found in the cupboard, sealed and wrapped. I took a few very welcome sips of my coffee before I began to speak. Okay, so, how I see it is we have 3 options. The first option is we leave now, try to get way out ahead of it. Second option is we leave tonight, which I'm not very keen on because I don't really want... What the hell? As I came around the edge of the table, my eyes scanned out towards the looming fog. And just at that second, over the top of the corn in the distance, I saw the roof of some yellow vehicle blast through the edge of the fog. As it sped down the road, I watched partially out of the confusion, having not seen anyone else in so long, and partially out of the hesitant curiosity, because we hadn't seen anyone in so long. "What is it?" Grace said as she noticed me trail off and began staring out the window. After a few seconds of me not answering, she repeated, "Hello, Trevin, what's going on? What do you see?" "Car," I said, not wanting to break my view from it. "Yellow car." Just then I saw the roof of the car change directions, and I knew it was on the road this house was on. He was coming towards the house. Quickly I rushed Grace and the girls upstairs. Bodhi still followed me around like he had all morning. I ran out to where the guns had been stored and grabbed the shotgun, making sure it had been loaded and ready. I knew it would only be a couple of minutes before the vehicle would be in our driveway. Bodhi trotted after me as I ran back to the front door and onto the porch. I raised the gun and waited. I watched as the vehicle, which looked to be some sort of model Jeep, roared very quickly down the road towards the house. They turned, almost losing control, into the driveway and skid sideways to a stop next to the SUV. The passenger was the first to open the door and step out. It was a tall, lanky man with dark hair, right about 6 foot tall. He stepped out, arms raised. well, one arm completely and the other as high as he could get it. He seemed to be injured, having 3 distinct slashes from his right shoulder down across his chest. His wounds looked very fresh, and the sight of them gave me mixed feelings about what was happening. "Please don't shoot," the man said, his voice straining from the pain he was in. "We mean no harm. We just need help." It was then that I noticed the purple blood on the bumper and scratches along the sides of the vehicle. They had clearly just been in the shit, I thought. Next, the driver opened the door and stepped out with arms raised, yelling that they just needed help. It was a shorter blonde woman. Both of them seemed to be around my age, maybe a little younger. "Hey buddy, I don't know if you know what's going on out here, but this shit has gone fucking crazy. My husband is hurt, and you're the only house we've seen for miles. He needs help, and we gotta go," she said as she walked over to her husband, arms still raised and very intense. Either help or get the fuck out of the way look on her face. With the gun still raised, I looked at Bodhi. I'll trust a dog's judge of character over my own any day. He didn't growl or bark. All he did was look intently at the new couple. "Who are you? Where'd you come from?" I finally called out to them, never dropping my aim with a shotgun. "I'm Grant. This is my wife, Brandy. Please, sir, we just need some help and we'll go," the man said, gesturing to his wounds. As soon as he said that, Bodhi ran off the porch and up to them, wagging his tail. He licked them both before turning back and looking at me. I lowered the gun before responding. "Okay, let's get you patched up. My name's Trevin, and this is Bodhi. Now listen, Bodhi seems to give you a pass, but I have my family in here, so if you try anything funny, just know I will absolutely not hesitate to shoot either of you." "Thank you. We just need some bandages and we'll leave, I promise," Grant replied, as the two of them put their arms down and began to make their way to the house. Bodhi ran back towards me and jumped onto the porch, landing next to me and continuing off into the house. Having heard no gunshots and watching the new couple walk towards the house from the upstairs window, Grace came downstairs bringing the girls with her, and everyone met in the kitchen of the house. Brandy helped Grant sit in one of the kitchen chairs, and once Grace saw the wounds, she instantly left to grab whatever medical supplies she could from around the house. "Looks like you got in a fight with one of the fog lurkers. Good for you coming out of it alive. It's not easily done," I said after Grant got his shirt off and I could actually inspect the wounds closer. "Did you kill it? Or did you manage to just get away?" "Brandy killed it. It knocked me down with this blow to the chest. She stabbed it through the ribs with a piece of broken rebar when it jumped on top of me." "Good job," I said, looking at Brandy. "You two are the first people we've seen in nearly a month. Where did you come from? How have you been surviving?" "Not too far away there was a group of survivors. We were staying there, just trying to make the best of the situation when the fog rolled in. Hey, we got overrun by all those creatures. We hadn't seen any in weeks, so it completely caught us by surprise," Grant responded, just as Grace came back into the room with supplies. Addie followed close behind, while Izzy crawled in shortly after. As Grant sat down and Grace began to study his wounds, trying to decide her best plan of action to get it all wrapped up, I returned the favor of introducing us all. "Are you a doctor? Or a nurse?" Brandy asked Grace. No, not at all, but I have sewn and bandaged him up enough. I would probably qualify at this point," Grace said, nodding her head at me as a means of pointing with her hands. I just smiled back at her before asking the question that had been burning in my mind since I heard mention of the survivor group. "How many are there? Are more coming?" In response, I got an uncomfortably long stint of silence and confused looks from the new couple. Then I realized that the wording I had chosen for my question is what had caused the dumbfounded looks. "Sorry, I mean survivors. How many are there? And are they coming here?" "Hi, my name's Addie," Addie interrupted. Izzy chimed in as well. "Well, hello there," Brandy said to both girls before directing her answer at me. "We're not sure. As soon as the mayhem started, we hid away for a few minutes and then escaped in a jeep. I know that we started with just over 30, but Well, we also watched a lot of them die from the creatures, and I'm not sure how many or even if any of them made it out. I'm gonna have to give you a few stitches. This is probably gonna hurt since we have no anesthetic, Grace said to Grant. Grant nodded in response and winced as Grace began pushing the needle and thread through his skin. Luckily for him, it only took a few small stitches, and he hadn't been hurt too badly. Do you two have any weapons, supplies, food, medicine? Anything with you? I said as Grace was finishing up, then began to wrap gauze around her work. You got it, owie, Addie said, pointing to Grant's wound and getting unnecessarily close to his face to ask her question. No, the Jeep was empty when we got into it. We literally have nothing. The Jeep does have a full tank of gas, but other than that, we escaped with little more than just our lives, Brandy answered. Hearing that, I looked at Grace. She met my eyes. Without words, we had a short conversation and made a decision. It's really nice being on the same page and in tune enough to make those little moments possible. Our decision was to let the two new people join us. I mean, they seemed to have decent, if not good intentions. Not to mention, it was just nice to have other people to talk to. Just to know that we weren't the only ones left alive, and the only ones going through all this. This new bit of information we'd gotten from them made me wonder just how I possibly could have missed a survivor colony so close to us. But then again, it may not have been as close as I was imagining it. And either way, it apparently wasn't there anymore, so I decided to not dwell on it too much. I also thought that strength in numbers might be a welcome sense of security if things were about to get crazy all over again. And just then, one of those little six-legged geckos crawled across the window and caught my eye. I looked at it just in time to see it puff out a little cloud of purple fog from right behind its head. Huh. Didn't see him do that before. I wonder. I thought to myself before asking my next question. Hey, look there. I've seen a lot of those today. Do you know anything about them? Pointing over at the lizard-looking creature on the glass. I hadn't seen them until today, after we saw the fog start to roll in yesterday off in the distance. Everyone looked over at the lizard crawling across the window in no discernible pattern. Bodhi let out a soft woof and a quick little growl before turning back to me and chuffing. Yeah, they showed up the other day before we were attacked. I don't know what they are or anything like that, but from what I've seen, they almost seem like some sort of little scout. Grant responded as he rubbed his shoulder and stood up. He thanked Grace for patching him up and took a few steps over to the window for a better look. Everyone in the room, except for me, walked over to the windows looking at the little lizard creature, and then off in the distance at the impending fog. Everyone watched in silence as another two little creatures crawled across the glass, each one tilting its head and looking in through the glass at us, then releasing another little puff of the purple haze. After what seemed like forever of us just standing and staring at the windows, I finally broke the silence. I know you two said that you wanted to leave after Grant got his shoulder fixed up, but I can't let you leave with no weapons or supplies of any kind. As I spoke, both Grant and Brandy turned to look at me. Also, I couldn't in good conscience just let you guys leave to fend for yourselves, so Grace and I were curious if you wanted to stick with us and be part of our little survival team. A massive look of relief washed over both their faces before Grant eagerly answered for me. Oh wow, yes, it would be awesome. I've been so worried about what we were going to do. Good, I'm glad to have some new faces, especially the kind that aren't covered in blood trying to run a doomsday cult, Grace said as she walked over and put her arm around me. From the looks of things, I don't think that we have much time left in the house, so we need to make sure that we're all packed up and decide if we need to leave tonight or wait till morning. I'm not sure how we'll be able to communicate between us now that we have two vehicles. Maybe we could find some walkies somewhere along the way? I think we can stay here one night before the fog and the creatures make it this far. So my vote is we double and triple check that we're all loaded up in the vehicles. Eat something here while we can still cook in the kitchen, then get out of here first thing in the morning. That sounds like a good plan to us, Brandy said, after the two of them exchanged looks. But where will we go? The plan is to head southwest towards Arizona. Trevin and I were talking about it yesterday, and it seemed like It was going to be the direction that involved the least amount of us probably freezing to death in the winter. Grace said. Mommy, Bodhi keeps licking Sissy, Addie said, again interrupting our conversation. Grant and Bodhi each nodded in response to Grace's answer where we were planning on going, and then we all looked to see Bodhi playing with Izzy by licking her face and letting her giggle for a few seconds before doing it again. We spent the rest of that day balancing out the load of supplies between the two vehicles as best we could. Having a second vehicle also meant that we were able to bring more supplies than we had originally anticipated, which was much more comforting. And still being a little weary of our two new companions, I tried to keep an eye on them, trying to make my final decisions on whether or not we'd be able to trust them. Bodhi and the girls seemed to take shine to them rather quickly, and Bodhi's trust in them, mixed with my trust and his judgment, swayed my decision pretty quickly. I tried to do my best at listening to my dog when he tried to tell me something. He's grown particularly well at alerting and steering us away from danger. The night after we had checked the supplies for what seemed like the millionth time, we cooked a hearty meal and we all ate together. We exchanged stories of what we had done before all this had started, and stories of what things we had been through. As it turned out, the only creatures that Grant and Bodhi had seen before the camps got overrun was the flame spiders. They told us that it had been their first encounter with the lurkers and the massive creature I called a behemoth. After the story about the camp getting overrun, it made me think that I need to come up with a better name for the spider creatures and the behemoth. I mean, flame spider only sort of makes sense, because we had learned that it hadn't been actual flames, but more of a strange orange, bioluminescent collection of hair. So the flame part didn't make any sense. Also, they only had 6 legs instead of 8, so if you really think about it, the spider part didn't make much sense either. Behemoth, as a name for the giant creature, was at least accurate, but given all the distinct attributes of the creatures, I just feel like I could do better with the name. And just then, I heard Grace call for me, and it snapped me out of my thoughts and brought me back to the moment. You want to tell them about the crazy creature-worshipping cult we ran into? She said, when she noticed that I was once again paying attention. I nodded, and I began to tell the story while they sat wide-eyed and listened intently. When it was over, we decided to go to bed for the night. They took one of the guest rooms while the rest of us piled up together in the master bed, as was now our new customary sleeping arrangement. As we drifted off to sleep, the girls and Bodhi softly snored next to us. My mind spiked with anxiety about the morning. I thought about what would happen if the fog crept in faster than I had expected, or if the creatures would get to us before the fog did. What the meaning or purpose of the little lizards was. So many curiosities and what-ifs flooded my mind as I tried my best to ignore them so I could fall asleep. And finally, late into the night, my brain gave up, and I was relieved at my newfound slumber. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video or listening to the podcast episode on tonight's podcast episode. You can always find the podcast at Spotify or on Google or wherever you happen to find podcasts. And if you want to hear even more from me, you can always check me out on my audiobooks. If you take a look on Audible, you can listen to Tales from the Gas Stations Volume 1, 2, and now 3 on Audible, as well as many other audiobooks that I've worked on. And I want to give a very special thank you to all of you who support me on Patreon, because quite honestly, you guys help me keep the lights on in my house, and I can't thank you enough for that. A very special thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Ken Lando Higuchi, Chompski, Bobby Karman, Nico kaeo, Tristain Pelton, Chase Burnett, Deanna Kraus, G Weevil 3, Chris Lovin, Freddie Krueger, Dr. Stein and Mr. Happy, Miranda Jeffries, Hugungshi, Justin Johnson, Raven Hart, Unknown Nobody, Michael Scharbrough, Kazan, ThisIsMyRealNameNoShit, Jason VB Wilson, InfernalOne, JimboTheHutt, Caspian, Jordan Nells, Hades' Nephew, Jordan Wayne Deckard, AcidSystem, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Someone You Love, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Raphael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. Thank you guys so much. Like, seriously, thank you guys so much. And if you would like to be able to join them, you always can at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. I love you guys, seriously. All of you who support on Patreon, who follow, who subscribe, those of you who listen, and those of you who lurk. Thank you for the amazing 10 years. And sweet dreams.